societal costs. So that's sort of the context. And I'll say at the outset, in the spirit of full disclosure, I am funded by the energy industry. So keep that in mind when I give this presentation. And the other thing I want you to keep in mind is I'm presenting a hypothesis, and it's a bit of a rosy scenario. This, I imagine that most of you are Californians and don't see this every day. This is what the middle looks like. And this is my home, and near my home in Champaign, Illinois. And just to put this in perspective, for those of you that think back to your introductory biology classes, remember biomes, biome types. There's the eastern deciduous biome and the southwestern deserts. This is the biggest biome type in the continental United States. Over 70 million hectares of the center part of the country are in a two-crop, row crop rotation, corn and soybean. Now, this has, of course, been quite devastating from the perspective of biodiversity. It is our major grain producer, so it's a very, very important ecosystem. And over the last 30 years, we've had a green revolution, and we've more than doubled crop production, grain yields from these kinds of ecosystems around the world. And that doubling has come mostly from, well, about 50-50 from crop improvement and from about the widespread use of different types of fertilizers. But I'm fond of saying that it's been a revolution that has not been bloodless. And I want to draw your attention just to this particular panel. This is nitrogen application that's gone on during the Green Revolution. Okay, so you can see that we've just enormously increased our application of nitrogen on the landscape with great ecological cost that I'll show you just a little piece of in a few minutes. The other thing, this is just as an aside, this is land area in agriculture, and I want you to notice that it's plateauing up at the top. And in fact, more recent data shows that we're pretty much farming all we can farm right now. So we have an enormous grain producing system, but it's come at great ecological costs. So what are some of these ecological costs, and how does that relate to a potential biofuels industry? Can we get biomass, reduce carbon inputs into the atmosphere, and do it in a sustainable way is what our group is very much interested in. This is an idealized graph showing the change in soil carbon through time. In the late 1800s, John Deere invented the self-scouring plow, steel plow. And when he made that invention, we were finally able to convert that 70 million hectares, which was in tallgrass prairie, finally able to break that sod and put it into agriculture. But what happened when we started breaking that sod is we aerated the soil. When we aerated the soil, vast quantities of carbon stored in that soil oxidized and blew into the atmosphere. Globally, there's about twice as much carbon stored in soils as there is currently in the atmosphere. About 780 gigatons, 10 to the 15th grams of carbon in the atmosphere, and over 1,500, almost 1,600 gigatons stored in the top meter of soils around the world. So when we began to till this soil, we blew off almost 50% of that carbon in the first 50 years of agriculture. And the question is if we replace some portion of this landscape that's currently an annual row crop, so it's that tillage that's the problem, can we start to rebuild some of this soil carbon back, getting an extra benefit from a potential biofuel crop? As I mentioned, we're putting vast quantities of nitrogen on this landscape. Most of that landscape that I showed you, that's 70 million hectares, is underlain by tiles that drain water away. It would be kind of a wet, standing water sort of area. And so they're underneath, about a meter or two down, are plastic pipes, and those plastic pipes capture groundwater and pump it into drainage ditches. Those drainage ditches where I live either go into the Sangamon River or the Wabash River, ultimately into the Mississippi River. That Mississippi River drains that entire 70 million hectares and dumps all that nitrogen fertilizer into the Gulf of Mexico, where it eutrophies the Gulf of Mexico. It causes a huge algal bloom. That algal bloom is hundreds of miles in diameter. Those algae die. When they die, they decompose, sucking all the oxygen out of the water column. That anoxic condition then kills what's living in the water column. So this is another cost of the Green Revolution. Don't get me wrong, I'm not an anti-farmer. We all eat and enjoy this, but these are some of the costs to be cognizant of. Well, at the University of Illinois, we've established the Energy Farm. And the Energy Farm is a side-by-side comparison of corn, sort of the current land use pattern. Corn is also being used as a first-generation feedstock. That means it's being used for ethanol production from the grain. Currently, about 27% of our corn grain goes to ethanol production. So that's kind of what we're doing today. And we're comparing corn, the biogeochemistry of corn, to 3 different potential feedstocks. Restored prairie, it's a 28 species prairie assemblage we've built on this landscape, switchgrass and miscanthus in a replicated way. So that's the experiment, and what we're trying to do in this particular experiment, I'm not going to show you a whole lot of data from it because we've really just gotten it going. We're in our 3rd year, and the crops are now just finally starting to mature. So I'm not going to show you much data, but the objective of this study is to close the biogeochemical cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and water. And what I mean by close is figure out all the fluxes, physical fluxes, or physiological fluxes and storage pools. And with that, then, make inferences about the sustainability of these different biofuel crops on the landscape. Well, for those of you that are uninitiated to biogeochemical cycles, this is what they look like. They're made up of pools and fluxes. The arrows represent fluxes, so that's a physiological process most commonly. This flux would represent total photosynthesis. An ecosystem scientist would call that gross primary production. This flux represents the sum of plant respiration and respiration from microorganisms living in the soil. What's left behind often ends up in plant material that dies and decomposes, and some small part of that may end up being stored in the soil as recalcitrant forms of carbon in the soil. So our experiment is designed to measure all of these pools or fluxes. And I'll just show you an example of one measurement that we make that captures the balance of these 2 fluxes, photosynthesis coming in and ecosystem respiration going out. It's called an eddy covariance measurement, not named after Eddy, but named after the way air moves across landscapes. Air moves across landscapes in parcels that bubble across the landscape, eddies, like bubbling water, boiling water. And we have very sophisticated instrumentation. This is a sonic anemometer and an open path gas analyzer that essentially add up all the downwelling carbon dioxide in the system and all the upwelling carbon dioxide in the system. The sonic anemometer tells the other instruments whether that air is moving down or up. The CO2 measuring device tells the CO2 concentration. And if you add all that up, you can get the net carbon dioxide balance. You essentially are measuring that ecosystem breathing CO2 out and CO2 into the ecosystem. And you add it up all year long. You can tell whether an ecosystem is a source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere or a sink of carbon dioxide. Is it a net storage? These are from data from our very first season. And this is time of day, and this is time of year. And blue represents quantitatively times or amounts of carbon dioxide being taken up, and reds and oranges are carbon dioxide being emitted to the atmosphere. And this is a corn crop, and this is a miscanthus crop. This first season, miscanthus was really just in its establishment phase, and it was a net source to the atmosphere. The disturbance of that soil surface for planting created a large flux of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Corn, however, was a net sink, right? A net sequester of carbon from the atmosphere. But what I think is going to happen over the coming years, and you can see a hint of it here, is look at how much longer the growing season is for miscanthus. This is a rhizomatous perennial that stays on the landscape year in and year out. It has a much longer growing season and ultimately much larger biomass production. So through time, we're going to see this arrow go down. A net sink is my hypothesis, and it's going to be a much stronger sink than we see for corn. Well, while waiting for crops to grow, we've done a couple of other experiments, and I just want to show you these experiments. They also illustrate how ecologists deal with processes that happen over long periods of time. We use what's called a space for time substitution. These dots represent areas around the state where miscanthus has been planted. Some of those plots are 7 to 8 years old. What we did is we went to each one of those locations, and we found a nearby cornfield, not very hard to find in Illinois, and we found a nearby undisturbed native prairie, exceedingly difficult to find in Illinois. About 1/10% is left. Where you find them is old settlement graveyards, basically. And the only disturbance is the 3x6 hole that's been dug, but they've been left intact. So that's a good place to find native prairie where the soils have been untilled. And by comparing soil carbon storage in native prairie with miscanthus, with corn, we essentially can replicate what would happen through time. So this is in the soil surface, the carbon concentration in native prairie. This essentially represents pre-John Deere, right? So imagine that bar representing 1850. This bar represents the soil carbon storage in corn. So that represents what's happened over the intervening 100 years, right, to soil carbon storage. And this is miscanthus and switchgrass. And you can see that even in the first 7 to 8 years of production, these perennial rhizomatous crops are rebuilding soil carbon. Not only a carbon storage, but also good for soil fertility. The other thing we did, desperate, while postdocs are waiting to measure things that are growing in the field, is we did a literature survey. And this is a literature survey of all herbaceous plants that are potential biofuel crops, and what happens to soil carbon as these plants have been established on the landscape. Let me just take you through a couple of examples. So the first two bars, this is corn. This is corn put where corn is always put. But the difference is the stover has been removed. So corn, they harvest the grain and they leave all the rest on the ground, mostly. And that rest on the ground is thought of as a potential biofuel source, a potential source of lignocellulose. And so if you scoop that up and save it, what happens to soil carbon? So even in these degraded landscapes, 5 and 10 years after this stover removal has taken place, so remember, soil carbon has dropped down 50%, going from prairie to corn. As you remove the stover, you continue to deplete soil carbon. So that's not a very good source of carbon for a biofuel, from a biofuel perspective, if you're interested in ecological sustainability. This is putting sugarcane where a forest once was. If you put a sugarcane where a forest once was, there's an enormous emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as that plant material decomposes and that soil carbon is emitted back to the atmosphere. And it happens for quite a long time. You see ultimately that sugarcane starts sequestering carbon in the soil, but there's over a 100-year payback time. It takes more than 100 years before you take that system from a net source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and turn it into a net sink. So if you're getting fuel from sugarcane, you have to essentially discount that advantage from an ecological perspective against these huge losses of carbon that have happened over time. All three of the perennial biofuels feedstocks start building soil carbon, this is again from a literature survey, pretty much immediately. Now I want to introduce you to the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle, unlike the carbon cycle, well, it's a gradient. The nitrogen cycle is very, very strongly dominated by microbial processes happening in the soil. Nitrification, denitrification is doing this interconversion of ammonium to nitrate. That nitrate, of course, is highly soluble and leaches to groundwater. That's the Gulf of Mexico problem. Also, denitrification and subsequent nitrification and subsequent denitrification by microbes in the soil produces N2O. This is an exceedingly potent greenhouse gas. Over 200 times more potent molecule for molecule at absorbing infrared radiation in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So a very, very important greenhouse gas. The big three are carbon dioxide, the big three anthropogenic sources are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And of course, water vapor in the atmosphere is a very, very important greenhouse gas also. And so the other thing we're very interested in is closing all the aspects of the nitrogen cycle. In agricultural systems, atmospheric input from fertilization, of course, is a real biggie. You guys have 96 well plates and pipetters, and we have tractors and farm machinery. So we win in this front. If you like big stuff, you get to play in my lab. This is the kind of stuff you get to play around with. I'm not allowed, by the way, near any of it, but my students and postdocs do this. So we're interested in measuring nitrogen fluxes in the soil, and I want to just talk just for a minute about some very preliminary data on nitrate losses. So to capture nitrate losses, remember I said all of these soils are drained? What we did is we put in more drainage tile above the other drainage tile. And we took these drains, so these are about a little less than a meter down, and we took these drains and we ran them to wells so that we could capture all the water leaving these experimental plots each year and then sample that to do chemistry on it. And so we have automated samplers, and they sample the water flow, and they provide water samples that we then go do inorganic chemistry with. And this is just some data on nitrate concentrations in the various plots. Here's here's switchgrass and probably our prairie. And here's corn. This is after 2 years. And here's corn and miscanthus. Miscanthus was very slow to establish. So here's our first year, and here's our second year. You can see that some of these perennial crops already are greatly reducing nitrate concentrations in groundwater. My hypothesis is as miscanthus starts to build biomass, it'll migrate down to this group. And by knowing, this is just a simple mass flow calculation, by knowing the flow rate and the concentration, you can calculate the total nitrate losses, and this is in kilograms per hectare, leaving the system. So here are two perennials, switchgrass and prairie assemblage, and here's miscanthus and corn, almost 20 kilograms. That's a lot of nitrogen. Bags of sugar of nitrogen, right, leaving that system every year in groundwater. Again, my hypothesis is that we move into the third and fourth year, miscanthus is going to migrate up toward the other perennial crops, and that this is a disturbance effect that we're seeing early on.
The column below, what does it refer to? The fourth column, NO3 load, what does that refer to?
A total kilogram. So we're just taking flow rate and kilograms to calculate the flow weighted concentration. and then using that to get the total emission from the system. Okay, so what does this mean on a total landscape scale? We're doing this experiment in Illinois, and we want to know essentially what the entire Mississippi River drainage is doing. And to do that calculation, we need to use a process-based model. And this is just a diagrammatic representation of one process-based model called DASENT, which is a very, very effective and good biogeochemical model, very good for soil processes. And process-based models essentially provide equations that convert material from one pool to another. Here's productivity of the crop. That material is then allocated to leaves, fine roots, and so forth. It then dies and goes into various soil pools. And there are mathematical equations that calculate the total material moving in a quantitative way or in an estimated way through each of those pools. So we have this model. We parameterize the model by field measurements. We validate it against other systems that we haven't used to parameterize to avoid circularity. And then we apply it widely. And this is very, very preliminary material. This is that model applied on county-wide climate and production data for the entire Mississippi River watershed. And you can't see the numbers, but what you can see are the colors. So this is soil carbon storage. This is soil carbon storage for corn, for miscanthus, for switchgrass fertilized, and for switchgrass unfertilized. Dark brown represents a lot, and light beiges represent a little. So when you replace a portion of corn, soybean agriculture with perennial feedstocks, you build huge quantities of soil carbon in the soil. This is nitrate loss. Dark blue is a lot being lost to groundwater, and light blue is a little. Miscanthus is very retentive, at least in our models, very retentive of soil nitrogen, so it's holding most of that soil nitrogen. It's a perennial, and when it dies back, it retranslocates that nitrogen into the rhizome and stores it for the next year. So it's a very, very conservative nitrogen user. It's better than switchgrass because switchgrass is commonly fertilized. Not to the extent that corn is, 180 kilograms of nitrogen per year in corn agriculture. It's lightly nitrogen fertilized, and it's not quite as strong a holder of soil nitrate, so that's why miscanthus is kind of in the middle. This is the total greenhouse gas balance. So this is the sum total of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And if it's pink, it's a net source to the ecosystem. And if it's a green, it's a net sink. It's sequestering greenhouse gases. And so our projections are, this is for corn, soybean rotation. This is for miscanthus. So as we go to perennial feedstocks, it looks like we can be converting the Midwest. And the Midwest, by the way, agriculture is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases globally. It looks like we can be converting this region from a source to a sink for greenhouse gases. It's a rosy picture. This is hypothetical. These data are very, very new. We're continuing with our model simulations, but I think quantitatively the story might change, but I think qualitatively these are the kind of outputs we're going to see. All right, so I've given you a fairly rosy picture for displacing first-generation feedstocks like corn with second-generation feedstocks like miscanthus, lignocellulosics, but I want to talk about a couple of the costs. And these are ecological and societal costs of going in this direction. One is the issue of land use change, direct land use change, and indirect land use change. I want to focus mostly on indirect land use change. This is a great concern that people have with displacing agricultural crops with biofuel crops. This is just a picture of various ecosystems going from low carbon storage to very high carbon storage. And you can imagine that if you replaced this ecosystem with this ecosystem, there would be a lot of emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So that's the direct land use change issue. And actually, we've been working very hard on quantifying what is the greenhouse gas value of an ecosystem, and I'll show you that calculation in just a minute. The indirect land use scenario goes something like this. American farmer takes a portion of his agricultural land and puts it in a perennial biofuel crop. Less grain is produced on that U.S. landscape. Grain prices go up. Grain profitability is now higher. Brazilian farmer says, hey, I can make more money if I plant more soybeans, choose into tropical rainforest to plant more soybeans. That's the indirect land use effect. If you do that, you're essentially displacing tropical rainforest with a perennial biofuel crop, with a huge net loss of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So these are our calculations. It turns out there have not been reliable calculations of what the total greenhouse gas value is of an ecosystem. And this is a first attempt to make those calculations, including all the storage and all the lost fluxes, the opportunity costs of that particular ecosystem for carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And it's no surprise that tropical rainforests have a lot of greenhouse gas value, and that temperate pasture have very little greenhouse gas value. And so you can imagine if you replace that ecosystem with this ecosystem, there's going to be a large emission that has to be factored into the total lifetime analysis of whether that system is profitable from an atmospheric carbon dioxide perspective. So direct and indirect land use change is a very important consideration when we think about wide-scale deployment of biofuel crops. And as you can imagine, the science is easy. The science of the biogeochemistry is easy. When you start talking about indirect land use change, you're talking about economic incentives and human behavior. And that's where it really gets quite dicey. And we'll have a speaker a little later on today who might talk about those two issues, Madhu Khanna. Another issue I want to talk just briefly about is the issue of food for fuel. This has been a huge debate in the literature and is a very real concern. And I use this example from the New York Times. In Southeast Asia, palm oil is used very regularly for cooking oil, and actually their dietary consumption of calories is quite a bit lower than ours, and so it turns out that palm oil is actually a significant portion of daily caloric intake in those parts of the world. Palm oil also, if you have a low compression engine, an old Mercedes diesel, you can squeeze it and put it right in a tank. Then it'll run on that. So it's a direct case where at the market you can buy oil for food or you can buy oil for fuel. And as that commodity goes up, its prices go up, as its value for fuel go up, it gets out of the reach of people to buy for cooking. And so there is this concern over food versus fuel, a very real concern when we think about, and again, I've given you the sort of rosy scenario about using biofuel crops in Midwestern landscapes to improve their biogeochemistry. What I haven't talked about and what's in the back of my mind all the time is moving this planet to 9 billion people in the next 20, 30 years. So we've got an increasingly growing food demand that's the background, that's the context for these kinds of discussions. All right, so what do I think? This is opinion, that we probably ought to lay off use of land currently used for food and feed when we think about deploying biofuel crops. Why am I talking about the Midwest? We're currently using 27% of that landscape for ethanol production at great ecological costs. I think if we converted to lignocellulosic feedstocks, we could produce more fuel with less land, food for fuel debate, and do it in a way that's ecologically sustainable, actually increase the biogeochemical sustainability of those Midwestern landscapes. Irrigation with potable water is probably a big no-no. This is what you're just trading fuel for water for fuel. This is what I was concerned a little bit about when we were talking about sunflower in the last lecture. That's one that we're going to have to circumvent. And the net greenhouse gas ought to be positive. So when you look at the kinds of things people are using for fuel these days, we probably want to stay away from maize from its obvious ecological costs, beans for competition with food production, palm oil a big no-no. Brazil has done a beautiful job with sugarcane. If they can go in the Cerrado and not move into tropical rainforest, it seems like a good sustainable system working for Brazil. So that's a possibility. I'd argue that maybe perennial feedstocks in Central North America might be viable. What do you get? I mean, what can we get? George W. Bush challenged the country to meet 30% of its liquid fuels with renewables by 2020. Can we do it? What's possible? That means we need about 130 billion liters of ethanol. If you were to use, let's say, maize stover to do it, and you assume that we have reasonably efficient conversion of lignocellulosics into ethanol, which we don't yet, but if you assume that that's doable at a reasonable conversion efficiency, you'd have to use, to meet that demand, you'd have to use about 37% of total agricultural land in the United States to do that. That's 52 million hectares. Currently, there are about 30 million hectares in corn, 35 million hectares in corn in the entire United States. We'd have to use more than the entire U.S. corn crop to do that, to meet those demands if we're using stover. Of course, we're still getting the grain off that landscape. If we go down to these high-yielding perennials, and this is mostly high-yield, low-nitrogen input, these are huge, huge, huge yields. 29 tons per hectare is what we're measuring in Illinois. At that level, we could probably do this with using about 9% of current U.S. agricultural landscape, or about 18% of current corn-producing landscape. 18% of current corn-producing landscape. We're currently using 27% of corn-producing landscape to produce corn ethanol. So less land than is currently used in corn ethanol, we could probably divert if we had a good, efficient way of converting lignocellulosics and go to that system. And so where are we? So where are we? I think we have potential to diversify our fuel portfolio at great ecological benefit with lignocellulosics. I think we have potential to re-engineer Midwestern agriculture from a system that has previously been used to maximize grain production. I think we can optimize that system for grain production, fuel production, and ecological sustainability if all this works out. This is sort of my vision. I am not an advocate of converting the Midwest back to tallgrass prairie. It's not viable. What I'm basically arguing is we'll fall on the sword. We've already have a highly manipulated landscape, 70 million hectares. Let's do it there rather than moving into desert environments, rather than moving into eastern hardwood forests. Let's manage this landscape for that. This is I'm editorializing now. This is sort of my vision and my view of it. One great frustration with this work is most of what I've shown you is preliminary. It's hypothetical. The policy arena is racing forward, legislating these kinds of transitions with virtually no data. And that never will change. And this has been a great frustration to me is we will have good numbers for them in 3 or 4 years. Those decisions will already be made in the political arena. Maybe they can get remade. I don't know. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Evan. I'm sure there are questions.
So how much of the carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere that were caused by humans were actually caused by the degrading soils compared to the fossil fuels?
Yeah, so roughly, I think the most recent estimate is 9 gigatons per year is coming from fossil fuel use, and about 3 gigatons, maybe a little less, 2.5 gigatons per year is coming from land use change. A portion of that is lost photosynthate, but most of that is decomposition. So that's 9 to 2 is about the ratio of total new emissions to the atmosphere.
This is perhaps a naive question about the nitrogen cycle, but you talked a lot about the nitrogen output and how that has negative consequences ecologically. You didn't talk that much about nitrogen input, and here in California, we like to grow things organically with either organic fertilizers at low concentrations. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not that's been looked at, growing things with little nitrogen input or no nitrogen input?
Yep. One of the things, so from a sustainability perspective, those are the big three: carbon balance, nitrogen balance, and water use. So you're absolutely right on the money. One of the things I'm very excited about with miscanthus is a previous study done in Rothamsted, England, has grown miscanthus for 10 successive years with repeat harvests with no nitrogen input and no loss of productivity. This is a strange thing. It was a curious thing. When we started growing miscanthus, we tried to parameterize the descent model to predict its growth rates. We now have it parameterized with 98% accuracy. But when we first tried, we couldn't predict the growth rate of miscanthus in the model at all. We were getting twice as much biomass in the field as the model said we should, until we flicked the nitrogen fixation switch in the model. It turns out miscanthus has free-living endophytes in it that we know contain the NIFH gene. We know they reduce acetylene. So we know they have nitrogen fixing capability. We know we can't predict its growth rate unless we assume it's a nitrogen fixer. We've yet to demonstrate nitrogen fixation in the field. So I think at least for miscanthus, we may be getting a really good deal in terms of very low nitrogen inputs because we think it may be meeting a significant portion of its annual nitrogen demands with fixation. Switchgrass does require fertilization, but at a much lower rate than about 1/3 to 1/4 than you would with a corn crop on that landscape. So from a sustainability perspective, that's a really big deal, is making sure that inputs are very low. And it's not just ecological sustainability, this goes to its economic viability also.
When you show that figure, how many hectares it takes to match 30% of fuel consumption, is that net production or total production? So production minus the carbon it takes to farm that land and transfer the carbon and then synthesize the ethanol, or is that total theoretical yield?
It's total.
Thank you.
Total. So a very important thing when considering the viability of these crops from an ecological perspective or an economic perspective is something called life cycle analysis, which is deep in the engineering community. The ecologists are just starting to embrace it now. but it's a total cradle-to-grave calculation of energy inputs and outputs, which is exactly what you're asking for.
One last question back here.
So you mentioned that the miscanthus has a nitrogen-fixing endophyte or endophytes, and I'm also looking at a plant that has systemic nitrogen-fixing endophytes. Is anybody doing work to transfer these endophytes to plants like corn and possibly facilitate low-input production of the crops we already have economic systems designed to handle?
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying that this is Angela Kent's work at the University of Illinois that I'm showing you. She's part of our professor there, but works closely with our research team. And she has identified 12 different endophytes growing in miscanthus, I believe 9 of which have the NIFH gene and are showing end fixation capability. She's taken 3 or 4 of those and transformed them to rice grown in sterile culture and gotten higher growth rates of rice with those endophytes, with the plants infected with those endophytes. So that's the approach she's taking. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.